We are really, really lucky to have some brilliant speakers over the next 3 days. And as this is the inaugural Native Creatives, we wanted to make it as special as possible. Just to give you a little bit of context about what Native Creatives is about. Many of you will have come to our mental health and wellbeing programme, which was last October, and that was organised as a response to the pandemic, to COVID-19, and there felt like there was lots of support for mental health and wellbeing for our pupils, but not a huge amount for our teachers. So as a response, we set up this programme, which was all about creativity, but about how to utilise it for creative arts teachers for your mental health and wellbeing. And it was really successful. We had a brilliant, brilliant programme. We had things ranging from managing mental health in the workplace to drawing for wellbeing. And because of its success, we found that there was definitely a gap in supporting our creative arts teachers and our primary arts leads in developing their personal and professional practice. Now, I know as well as anyone from a personal viewpoint that when you are teaching and you are giving all your creativity to your students, it's very, very difficult to find the time for your own creativity, finding the time to engage in arts and culture, to visit museums and galleries, to go to the theatre, to see a dance performance. And we wanted to find a space where we could continue the conversation about developing your creative practice. So these sessions of Native Creatives are designed for you, the teacher. They're not CPD sessions. They are not for you to go back to your senior leadership team and say, yep, tick box, we've done this for the school, this is great. This is about your personal and professional practice. Now, the offshoot of that is that hopefully it's going to benefit you as a classroom teacher and as a practitioner, but initially it's about you as an artist or somebody that just engages with arts and culture. So we really hope that you enjoy these sessions. As you probably know, they are over the next 3 days, 4:30 to 5:30 each day, with 6 amazing speakers. We've been so lucky this time to get such brilliant speakers. And then the next Native Creative events will be held in June, and the focus will be slightly different. And then moving forwards over the next year, we'll have a different focus for each programme. And what we're hoping to do is continue the conversation around how to continue to practice your art form or your engagement with arts and culture whilst delivering a creative arts subject, or as a primary arts lead, or just somebody who is a teacher who happens to have a passion and an interest in arts and culture. So Native Creatives came from natives being something that's really innate and inbuilt in you, and creatives obviously is this huge imagination and thriving on creativity. So that's where it kind of came from. I'm going to ask that, what was I going to ask you? Now I've asked you about turning your cameras on if you would like to. I'm going to introduce our very, very first speaker today, who's going to talk for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we are going to move to a Q&A afterwards. So let me get to where I need to go to. I can't quite believe that we have this speaker for us today. Pat Thomson is one of the most interesting people I've ever come across, and such an advocate for creativity and creativity within schools. She moved from Australia to the UK to become Professor of Education at the University of Nottingham, where she's known for her interdisciplinary engagement with questions of creativity and socially just learning and change. She mainly researches the arts, creativity and other kinds of experimental approaches in schools and community settings, including galleries and museums, with a focus on how schools might change to become more engaging and meaningful. She works with scholars in their academic research and writing, and is the current convener of the Centre for Research in Arts, Creativity and Literacies at Nottingham University. Her academic writing and research education blog Patter is archived at the British Library, and her posts are frequently published elsewhere. You can follow her on Twitter and Facebook, and those links will be put into the chat box, and you can see a range of her websites, all of which we'll post in the chat box. She has a long-term partnership with Tate Learning, and it was the TAIL project, the Tracking Arts and Learning Engagement, that Pat carried out with the RSC and Tate between 2015 and 2018 that led me to ask her to present today. I read something about Pat today online. I don't know who wrote this, and Pat may tell me that it was completely made up, but I thought it was really nice. I'm going to read it to you. It said, when Pat Thomson was young and fearless, she started an alternative school. This experience helped her to understand that it was possible to do schools in ways that were more engaging and equitable. I just thought that was a really nice thing to start with. So we're both privileged and humbled to have Pat as our very first speaker at the inaugural Native Creative event of Spring 2021. So I'm now going to hand over to you, Pat. Thank you very much for coming.
Okay, thank you. I'm just about to inflict my screen on all of you, so just bear with me for a couple of minutes while I sort that out. One of the nasty things about this form of presentation is you always get this kind of stutter at the start of things as we swap screens and do various technical bits and pieces. Thanks, Jen, for asking me to come today. And I was like, being with teachers, obviously better being face-to-face, because I used to be a teacher. I worked in schools for 27 years, and indeed I did start an alternative school, and I was a baby when I did it. So I've kind of got a long history with schools in Australia, and I guess it's where my home and my heart really is, even though I'm now in England and in a university. But I particularly wanted to kind of set the scene. I think really I've taken that as my brief today, to maybe think a bit about what it might be to be both a teacher and also to play around with either the arts or creative practices or both. And I guess that's something that I did myself when I was in a school. I've got a background in drama and media, and as well as in a liberal arts degree. And I guess when I was working in schools, I was always playing around with journalism and cameras and student radio stations, but also was doing that outside of school as well. So there was quite some resonance between what I did outside of school and what I did inside of school as well. So that's the kind of thing I am going to talk about today. But I thought I'd better start by just trying to define my terms a bit. And you'd seen that the title of the talk was Practice Makes Pedagogy. And so I've got these two kind of labels that I'm working with. And I particularly wanted to talk about pedagogy. It's a word that some people really don't like, but I like it because, although I don't like the way it's used a lot of the time, I like it because it comes from, it's about what you know. It's not necessarily about, in the first instance, about what you do. It's what you know about doing. So it's actually the kind of about the knowledge base for teaching, and it's the knowledge that you use in order to create a teaching practice. And, you know, so it's a bunch of stuff that we actually get trained in initially, I guess, in our kind of formative training program, but then we keep adding to in all kinds of ways as we are more experienced. So it is knowledge about the discipline that we're working with, and that might be a range of subjects if you're in primary, or it might be a particular discipline or two if you're in secondary. But it's also about what it means to teach in that discipline or disciplines. And it's also knowledge about schools and education, and it's knowledge about children and young people. And it's all of that stuff together which actually goes to make knowledge about teaching. And usually you hear pedagogy talked about as if it's a method of teaching. So people will say, you know, you'll see it online if you look up pedagogy, it's about a teaching method. But I don't think it actually is that. It's the knowledge from which teaching methods are made. And as teachers, we actually do that methodically. You know, we reflect on what we're doing. We develop a kind of repertoire of practice that we can draw on. You know, we don't teach the same way every day. We don't teach the same way depending on where we are in a module of work. We don't teach the same way from one year to another, or indeed 1 week to another, because we're continually adjusting in the light of who's in the class as well as what we want to teach. You know, in Australia, it was also about the weather. You know, like if there was a a really hot wind coming in the classroom, we all knew we had to have terrific behaviour management because the kids were going to go feral. So there's all kinds of things that go into understanding how you actually teach, but generally it goes under the label of pedagogy. And a pedagogy it becomes a practice. We make it a practice. And the thing about a practice, whether we're talking about an arts practice or a creative practice or teaching practice, is that it's something that becomes kind of regular and routine. It is about the application and the development of knowledge and skills, and it involves all of us. You know, it's our bodies, it's our minds. I have to say, one of the things you really miss when you're teaching online, and I'm sure a number of you have had that experience, you become just aware of how much you use visual cues in teaching situations, how much you use your body to go and stand by somebody, how you listen for kind of changes in the chat that's going on in the classroom. It's a very kind of whole body practice teaching, but it's also shaped by the kinds of rules and in the school, by the conventions about what teaching are, you know, how people are feeling, but also our kind of values as well. So these two things kind of go together, you know, pedagogy, the knowledge actually we make into a practice, and it becomes, and teachers all have their own practice, and we have our own kind of knowledges that we build up over time. And I guess the thing I'd want to say is that this is a kind of, it's a disciplined process in both senses of the words. If you're going to make something pedagogical, then you're doing it about something and with something. So you're working with a particular kind of set of subject kind of knowledge in order to actually bring it to life. So it's always a kind of an applied process. Putting knowledge into practice requires stuff to actually work with. So that's my definitions out of the way. So now if I use these words, you know what I actually mean when I'm talking about them. What I want to talk about really are the ways in which the practice of teaching and the practices related to the arts or creativity or cultural participation and production more generally, how they actually overlap and come together with teaching practice. And it's this kind of overlapping area that I think I've probably been interested in all my life, but I've got able to kind of spend a lot of time thinking about it since I've been in a university. And there's lots of people that sit in the middle, in between these two things. So sometimes we have people who are called teaching artists. Some people think of themselves as that kind of label. I'm an artist who teaches, and that might be someone who's outside of school, or someone who's inside of school might think of themselves as a teaching artist. It might be somebody who thinks that you know, bringing their arts and creative and cultural participation and production together means they've got a very flexible and extensive and expansive and generous kind of pedagogical repertoire, lots of things to call on when you're actually in the classroom. You've got lots of options that you can use to invent and adapt and improvise, as well as build into planning. And the other kind of identity that sits in here is what we call the arts broker teacher, and I'm going to talk about some of these things today. And so I wanted to recognise, of course, that not everybody who teaches and who has an artistic practice necessarily put them together. Sometimes people choose one or the other. D.H. Lawrence is I'm going to give you a couple of Nottingham examples, but D.H. Lawrence is a pretty good example of somebody who started out as a teacher. I gather he was a fairly indifferent teacher, I have to say, judging by his teaching reports, which are available. I think they're certainly available to me because he did his teacher training at Nottingham in the same school of education that I work in. He only taught for a couple of years, and then he decided that actually he was going to go off and be a writer. So, you know, he made a choice. He started out in teaching, was thinking about an artistic practice, decided to go off. And I have to say, one of the things I really love about online resources, and it's great with kids, is to actually show them manuscripts of people who are, you know, if you're into kind of creative writing, which I'm very interested in, to actually show them the manuscripts of people and how much they worked on them and worked over them. D.H. Lawrence was infuriating because, you know, his publisher would send him things that looked like final copies of things, and he'd rewrite all over them again. Some of his short stories, I think, were printed several times before they were actually able to be released into the world. And one of his short stories, I think he revised even 2 years after it had been published. So he was a drafter and reviser extraordinaire. This is one of the kind of British novelists you've probably never heard of, but also from Nottingham, Stanley Middleton. And Stanley Middleton actually won the Booker Prize in the late 80s with Nadine Gordimer for a book called Holiday, and which is a kind of very old-fashioned kind of book, and out-of-fashion book, I think we'd think now, sort of Middle England, very mannered, psychological kind of book. But Stanley Middleton was a lifetime teacher. I mean, he also trained at Nottingham, but his entire life, from the beginning till the end of his life, he worked at one school, High Pavement School in Nottingham, and he was a middle leader of so he was a subject leader of English in this secondary school. And Stanley Middleton's routine was, you know, he'd teach all day at school and then he'd go home and do his marking, and he'd have his tea and make sure his daughters did their homework, take the dog for a walk and come back and write for a couple of hours. And doing that in his whole life, I think he wrote 27 novels. So, you know, it was pretty productive. But he kept his artistic life very separate from his teaching life. And that was fine. And he was able to be pretty successful at both things. So, you know, we've got D.H. Lawrence who swapped, and then we've got Stanley Middleton, who managed to maintain both practices, but in a pretty separate kind of way. And then we have people who bring them together. Now, you might not have ever heard of Maria Panis, and I hadn't until recently, but she was an arts therapist, and she worked particularly, she's very famous for having worked with, she's apparently very famous, I say, me never having heard of her, for working with children as they were repatriated out of concentration camps in Europe, and particularly when they came to England. And there's a film made about her which was released last year called The Windermere Children, and I think you can find it if your school belongs to Learning on Screen, for example, which is a great thing for schools to subscribe to. You can look it up on Learning on Screen and watch it. It's a bit of a tearjerker, but she was a very accomplished artist as well as an art therapist, and she had, I think, one of the characteristics of a lot of people who bring their art practice and their teaching practice together. She had a very strong kind of philosophy about what she was doing, and you can see this is her view of what it is that people who were a pedagogue, in other words, people who practiced their pedagogy, about what they did. And if you look at some of the things here, you know, she's talking about well-being. That's eudaimonia is well-being. It's a belief about well-being. It's a belief about how you might relate to people, about how you might talk to people, about how you might encourage children to learn and to grow and develop. And I think a lot of people who work in the arts particularly have and are able to articulate their kind of view of the pedagogy that they use in the classroom, and this is very often informed by their art practice. So Maria Panis kind of represents one version of someone who's bringing together some of the things that she believes from her art practice and some of the things that she believes about education, and putting them together in a kind of personal philosophy. And what I want to do really is now just talk about some of the things that we think we might know about what happens when, goodness me, when teachers bring their artistic practice and their teaching practice together. So what happens when you actually make this kind of hybrid practice? So I wanted to start by just talking about the National Writing Project. I don't know how many of you know about the National Writing Project. It's been running in the US now for about 30 years or more. It's probably now the longest running arts-based professional development program in the world. And what it does is basically support teachers to develop their own writing practice. They do talk about how that practice might be made pedagogical and how it might carry into the classroom. But it's first and foremost about developing teachers themselves as writers. So the view is that if teachers are confident in their own writing practice and think about their own writing practice as a kind of creative or an arts-based practice, then they will then think about what this might mean if some of it was taken into a classroom. So in other words, the National Writing Project doesn't develop sets of lesson plans. It doesn't develop a blueprint for how it is you might teach creative writing in the classroom. Its view is always that it's the teachers who are actually able to do that kind of pedagogical work, and they do it individually and collectively. And these are their beliefs. You can see that here, that writing, sharing and reflecting together within a teacher-writer community strengthens and expands our pedagogical capacity. Something about writing as a meaning-making process which constitutes an action in the world and also holds the possibility of transformation. So, you know, you can see there's views, as there was with Panis. There's an explanation here of a wider set of beliefs which underpin the kind of artistic practice, but also the pedagogical practice that it informs. The National Writing Project's been evaluated numbers of times, always, you know, in very glowing terms. And there are some versions of the National Writing Project now in England. So the UK Literacy Association supports some groups of teachers as writers, and you can find those by going to the UKLA website, also by looking at I think it's probably called #WritingRocks, for instance, on Twitter. There's a website called Writing Rocks, which has got some research on it and some information. Teresa Kremen at Open University and the Arvon Foundation and Deborah Myhill have been working together for a long time now, looking at teachers as writers. So this is kind of starting to emerge in England in particular as well, but it's building on the kind of model that the National Writing Project developed, which in the first instance is always about the creative practice of the teacher. And I might say that's exactly what Tate does too. I mean, Jen said earlier that, you know, I've been working with Tate Learning for a long time, and it's true, it's about 12 years now I've been hanging about the professional development they do, and they have exactly the same attitude. The professional development that they do is always about developing the teacher. I just wanted to have a quick look at, and that's actually a picture from, I think, Tate Learning. And teachers playing with stuff, nice stuff. So Creative Partnerships is ran in England from 2003 to 2011, but they're going in all kinds of, still going through Creativity, Culture and Education, which is now a charity, but they're still going in all kinds of other parts of the world, including Wales and Northern Ireland, Scotland, Chile, Thailand, Australia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all sorts of places. And they've continued to work particularly on what happens when artists and teachers work together. So this is a different kind of process. It's not an artist in residence model. It's actually looking at what happens when you put together someone who's got a long-term artistic practice and someone and a really experienced teacher generally, and it understands people, those two bits of the circle, if you like, as having overlapping but complementary approaches and practices. So the idea is not that the teacher becomes an apprentice to the artist or the artist becomes an apprentice to the teacher, but rather they contribute the specific kind of discipline, knowledges and skills that they have, and to see what they can do when those two things get put together. And they do develop a kind of what I would call a sort of hybrid pedagogy, which both of them build together, and they often develop a kind of shared repertoire between them. And that's something which my colleague Chris Hall and I did a lot of research on, is this kind of process of what happens when artists and teachers work together. And one of the things we've seen, which I thought might be just helpful to say, is that when people have thought initially about creative practice in England at the beginning of creative partnerships, so way back in 2003, I think there was a kind of notion that what was going to happen was that, you know, everything was going to get tossed out the window and everything was going to look really kind of wildly different than it had before. Whereas I think what we saw happening over time, bearing in mind that Chris and I observed this for a long time, for the 8 years of the program, in fact, was that people very often started not by chucking everything out. So they didn't bring the teaching and the creative practice together and thinking, I'm going to transform all of my teaching practice at once. They very often found places in the ordinary things that teachers do where it would be helpful to be creative. So the repertoire expanded specifically in a kind of, depending on the discipline, depending on the subject matter that was being taught, depending on the kids. We often saw people using a creative or artistic process in order to introduce a topic to kids. Okay, so it would be a way of getting past what it is that kids might think might be involved in something, but actually making something, you know, really exciting or interesting or curious or puzzling. That was also used, creative practices were also used to kind of investigate what students already knew about something. And when I say that, I don't just mean what was taught in previous years, but also what they knew kind of like from their everyday life. You know, kids often know stuff, for example, about science because they watch a whole lot of science programs on television, or they read a whole lot of science books at home, or they grub around in the backyard, or they're out doing all sorts of things. So, you know, finding out what students already know, what we sometimes call funds of knowledge, what funds of knowledge they already have, bringing that into the classroom, making that available to everybody, sharing that as a kind of basis for beginning a topic. Creative practice was often used to explore a topic, to practice what had been taught, or to apply something to a new situation. Now, you notice what I've left out here, and the thing that as a teacher you'll see, there's room in here for direct instruction, okay? So there's no, very often when you're teaching a subject, you need to do some direct teaching to introduce concepts. So you don't, generally what we saw is that wasn't abandoned, okay? So there were still routine exercises, there was still some of the things that you would recognise that ensure that kids actually grasp the stuff that they need to know. But creativity was applied to these specific kinds of parts of the learning process. And one of the places where creative practice was very helpful was for kids to be able to demonstrate what they'd learned, so that they were able to produce something where they actually had to use everything they knew in order to do the kind of task that was required of them, and in revising. So, you know, revising often sounds like it's going to be really dull, but actually you can revise in a bunch of quite creative ways. So you know, at the end of Creative Partnerships, I think that was one of the things that we Chris and I were fairly clear about, is that if you can kind of work out where is the most interesting and helpful place or places to think about being creative, that's likely to produce a more satisfactory experience for the teacher and the student than if you just think about how am I going to make this module of work creative, or how am I going to make this topic more interesting. So that was kind of one of the learnings from Creative Partnerships, I think, and it's something that they apply now, I think, where they talk about high performance classrooms. And let me just finish off by just talking a little bit about arts broker teachers. And this does come from our Tracking Arts Learning and Engagement project, a 3-year project, as Jen said, with the Royal Shakespeare Company and with Tate. It was a secondary school project, and we looked at GCSE to A-level students. And one of the things the questions we asked was, how do teachers who have an arts or a creative practice, how do they make that pedagogy, and what happens for the students? Okay, so we were absolutely interested in this kind of question of making practice pedagogical. We have now got a kind of a follow-on project to this now. We are looking at primary schools at the moment, and well, we've just started. It's a bit tricky given COVID, but the idea is to try and work with the things that we've seen in secondary schools and see if we can add to them and make them more nuanced and more complex by looking at what it is that primary teachers do. So the thing about the arts broker teacher is that the two practices, if you like, the arts practice and the teaching practice, kind of feed each other. So there's a sort of process, I think, where people wouldn't say, as opposed to Stanley Middleton, who chose, and D.H. Lawrence, who chose, people actually find putting the two things together to be a very kind of productive process, and actually a kind of personally, professionally satisfying process as well. So if I had to point to what an arts broker teacher might look like, I might point you to example to Chris Francis. Now, Chris actually wasn't part of our research project, and so I can't point you to some of the people because they are, you know, given research, they have to be anonymous. But Chris is an example that you can actually have a look at on the web. And Chris has got a fantastic kind of Instagram account and website called Art Pedagogy, and where he just does really interesting things. He talks about his own teaching. There's a very interesting kind of project that he and John Nichols from Thomas Tallis have been doing. John is photo pedagogy, and they are developing really a kind of knowledge about the teaching of art and photography, and they've developed a set of understandings or of what they call threshold concepts, which relate to art and photography, and you can download them from their website. So they're engaged in a kind of professional conversation, not only within their school, but also outside their school. And both John and Chris are very, I guess, have the kind of characteristics that we would say are typical of arts broker teachers. And I'm sure some of you are arts broker. You're probably all arts broker teachers, which is why you're here. So, you know, I hope you feel affirmed by this description and you can kind of recognise it. So generally, arts broker teachers are people who've got a kind of an art practice outside the school. So, you know, they they themselves are a kind of teaching object for students, really, because they embody what it means to be culturally engaged and to be actively participating in arts and culture outside of school. So, you know, they may go to a gallery on the weekend and they'll kind of come in and talk about it. They might have seen a really interesting program on the television and they're coming in and talking about that. They often, you know, encourage students to not only they take kids out when it's possible, but also encourage kids to go to places on their own. They like to understand what kids are doing culturally and artistically outside the classroom, outside of school, because very often students do have arts and cultural practices on their own with things like YouTube, for example, as well as, you know, dance, ballet, drama, all kinds of other things. But generally, the arts broker teacher wants students to enjoy the arts as much as they do. So that's really the thing. So they do what they can with the support of their school to get students involved in arts activities. And that means that setting up partnerships with arts organisations, often multiply, they help to support the arts and creative practice in the school. And you can see here just a couple of, I mean, I haven't done this with all the slides, but you can see here a couple of examples of quotations from students where we can actually see what it is that is the result of teachers doing this. We've got a quote here from, you know, I love this quote. Me mum and me brother went to the sculpture park last week because my dad was at work and we saw this very tall one. So I always want to know what the very tall one was that they saw, that, you know, the school helped me to become a member of Tate. So you can see this is what actually happens. Arts broker teachers are encouraging their students to be engaged in arts in the way that they are. When we looked at what they did in classrooms, we could see that they were working with all of the student. They weren't just thinking about the subject. They wanted to get to know the students, their ideas, their experiences. They were really concerned to, particularly in arts subjects, to get the kids to develop their own artistic practice, to think creatively in the way that they were doing in their own creative practice. They had what we call more kind of equal relationships in terms of, it wasn't that they were friends, no, but there was a more, what we call a more even-handed dialogue. So there was more, the teachers spent as much time listening as they did talking, very actively listening, responding and interpreting what kids were saying. But the teachers are also very keen to share their knowledge and their skills. But they very much worked from this kind of view that everybody was capable of having ideas and everybody was going to be able to do something creative. You can see here the student says in art they say you could be doing, whereas in other subjects they say you should. There was a kind of something special very often in secondary schools about the room. So, you know, it was very much the case when kids came into the art room or the drama room, it was kind of like, you're an artist in here. This is not the school, the rest of the school. In here, you're an artist, you behave like an artist, you think like an artist. The rooms were often very carefully designed in order and managed in order to allow students to come in, pick up their work at the beginning of the lesson, get on with it. You know, but there were also often they were often really packed with examples of stuff that other students had done in art rooms, or I guess signs and, you know, of other productions, for example, in the drama room. And the relationships with teachers were very often quite different. Teachers managed behaviour differently. The kids often talk to us about the art room or the music room, the drama room as a kind of sanctuary, that it just ran with a different kind of rhythm, and there was something about everybody all working together. And I really like this kind of notion of seniors. I don't know if you know this, but it's a kind of Brian Eno thing, you know, that he's not interested in genius, he's interested in seniors. So he doesn't think anybody just does something creative and brilliant on their own. It's actually about, it comes out of a kind of scene, it comes out of a collective organisation, which is not simply people, but also the stuff that there is available and the stuff that's inspirational. And, you know, so the space is kind of important, but the way the group actually works together is important. And I think one of the things that we saw in a lot of the arts broker teachers' rooms in secondary schools was it was very much about creating, as much as they could, a kind of a senior setup, a little bit gimmicky, but, you know, it's Brian, you know. And the kinds of curricula, I guess, that the arts broker teachers organised wasn't about lessons. It was generally about modules, a module of work, but there was a lot of attention paid to the design of tasks, which would allow students to grasp the kind of meta and meso and micro level concepts that were being taught, as well as acquire and practice skills, engage with knowledge, which was often very challenging. The work were often required kids to embark on things which they didn't think they could do to start with. And of course, this is the teachers' experiences as well. When they're doing their own practice, they're often experimenting, having a go at something they're not sure if they can accomplish. There was a lot of kind of use of students' own interests. There was always direct skills instruction, certainly in the junior years, and some later as it was required. It was very much immersed in kind of what was going on in contemporary thinking about the arts and creativity, often linked to quite high stakes performances and outcomes, so things like performance and exhibitions, publications with real audiences. So it wasn't just for exams and marks, it wasn't that they were unimportant, they were, but there were also these other occasions to actually engage in a kind of real art practice where you're actually working with a real kind of audience, and that's always part of what you do in an arts practice, is kind of think about how it is that you're going to communicate your ideas to a particular audience or readership. Apologies for that noise. And there was, their practice was often connected to the kind of professional applications. So dance, for example, was often connected in one way or another to the kind of professional norms that you might see in a dance company, and you'd get that kind of blurring of professional practice with what was actually going on in the classroom. And finally, I think we'd say that generally people were not afraid to tackle big and difficult topics. It's what Maxine Green called being awake to the world. So there wasn't a kind of sense that a lot of topics were taboo. You know, if kids wanted to talk about particular kinds of issues, and I mean, I have to say I sat in on amazing conversations in classrooms about really deep and difficult philosophical questions, for instance, which come out of the process of senior secondary students in particular trying to develop their own creative projects. I'm pretty sure I'm going to see that in primary schools as well, and I can't say I will yet, but I'm absolutely convinced that it's not beyond the capacity of primary kids to have really interesting and deep conversations too, just as they do in secondary schools. But it was certainly the kind of intellectual challenge as well as the practical challenge was there. And again, that's because in part, that's what the kind of teachers are doing as well. So there's a kind of sense of, if you've got your own artistic practice and you know what's involved in it, you know that how complex it is, but the mix of intellectual, practical skills, knowledge that it involves, that's the way that you're actually thinking about what you do in the classroom. So we saw, nearly done, nearly half hour's nearly up. So, you know, we saw arts broker teachers also fostering particular kinds of habits in students. I know you're talking with Bill Lucas later, and Bill's going to talk about some of these things, I'm sure. He talks about them, I think, slightly differently, what we probably mean the same kinds of things, you know, so questioning, doing research, building expert knowledges, not knowing, evaluating, being persistent, you know, developing these kind of artisan habits. That this was all part of the teachers' engagement with their own kind of artistic and creative practice, and that was also what they were expecting to support and develop with the students as well. So that's me. I think that's my half hour. But I guess the major message really is that, you know, as someone who played around with arts practice and teaching practice, I think it's a hugely productive thing to do, as long as you can keep hold of the workload and don't exhaust yourself by trying to do everything at once. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat. That was so interesting. So many useful things to take home from that. Would anybody like to ask any questions to Pat? If you want to wave your hand or raise the little icon, just having a look through. There's so many people on this call, it's difficult to see. Or have you all been completely bombarded by so much information you just need to digest it all?
Somebody's asked in the chat, can you suggest a reference from this perspective that
that's right,
pedagogy is not just teaching methods? Yeah, almost anything I've written, and I can send you some references for that. But it's not uncommon, and in fact, almost anything written about teaching which comes from, say, a Nordic country or from Germany will absolutely work with this perspective that pedagogy is not just method.
Thank you. Oh, we're getting lots of lovely good comments here. Does anybody else want to wave or raise their hand? So many interesting things. I'm really interested in this, particularly in this hybrid practice, which had never occurred to me before, of really thinking, like, try not to separate your teaching practice from your artistic practice. And I'm just wondering whether that, it's now occurred to me that perhaps that was an unconscious thing that was happening as I was teaching anyway, that maybe it's not something that I need to kind of think I need to make happen. It just happened naturally. And I wonder whether that happens for lots of people.
I'm sure it does. But of course, if you're going to teach anybody else about it, or you're going to justify or explain it, it does actually help to kind of make it explicit. I think a huge amount of teaching is kind of tacit. You know, we know all kinds of things that we actually don't explain to people, and sometimes we kind of explain to trainees when they're in our classrooms, but a lot of the time we're actually just doing it, and we hope, you know, we expect them to observe it and get it. And occasionally I wonder if that's one of the reasons why people think teaching's easy and anybody can do it, is because we don't actually talk about how complex it is. But I have to say, I kind of learned partly about bringing the two things together. I mean, you know, one of the things I do is write, and I have always written, I think. And I remember coming into the classroom one day, and this is kind of like pre-computer, with a kind of typewritten sheet, and it had been cut up and re-stuck together with paste. So it was literally a kind of cut and paste. And I brought it into the classroom because the kids I was teaching at the time were just really reluctant to do any revision. A lot of kids are reluctant to do revision. I'm done. I've got my X number of pages. That's it. You know, you can bugger off now, miss. Not in so many words, but you know. But I brought in this bit of my work and said, you know, look, this is what I do. Why don't I bring in every version of this thing that I'm writing now, and you can see all the various versions that I go through. I'm not asking you to do anything I don't do. And I have to say, it was a bit of a watershed moment with the kids, where they suddenly went, oh, okay, you know, like this is this really is what people do. You know, you don't just write your 2 pages and you're done with it. Yeah. So, and I often, you know, because I'm, you know, really interested in the visual arts, I mean, I often go into art rooms where teachers have got a work that they're doing in the classroom, so the kids can actually see them progressing on their work as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's suddenly so many people want to ask you things. We've got our second speaker happening in 5 minutes, and I wanted to just say that in the chat box we have put where you can follow Pat on Twitter and on her Patter Facebook group. So I think if you do want to follow up with Pat and ask any questions, or if you wanted to contact us at Festival Bridge, then please do, and we can put you, thank you, Georgia has just put that into the chat box where you can follow Pat on Twitter and on Facebook. If you do want to contact us at Festival Bridge, then please do, and I'm sure Pat won't mind if we follow up some questions with her later on. We have got a Jamboard link into the chat box as well. If you wouldn't mind clicking it, there it is. Thanks, Georgia. And just answering the question as to one positive or the most positive thing that you've taken away from this session. That would be really helpful for both Pat and for us at Festival Bridge to be able to move forward with these sessions. But I would just like to say thank you so much, Pat, for a brilliant, brilliant talk. So inspirational, so many things to take away from that. And people are putting huge amounts of positivity into the chat box. I do hope that you are able to join us for some of the other talks, maybe Bill Lucas, maybe Susan Coles later on in the week. I'm sure you're very busy, but yeah, thank you. That was amazing. Okay. And thank you, everybody, for coming to our very first Native Creatives event. I did forget to say that this is a Festival Bridge-led programme, and if you do want to know more about arts and culture and how we can support your schools, particularly in East Anglia, then please do get in touch with us through our website or from our email address. So thank you very much, and hope to see you in the next session.